Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 12th of June. Actually, quite a lot of updates this week. As always, this is useful. A like and subscribe is appreciated. Also, as always, I have the chapters down below so you can jump to a particular set of updates that maybe you care more about than some of the others. New videos this week. I had a huge amount of fun, which I know is going to sound kind of strange, creating a video all about regular expressions or regex. I spent a long time preparing a whole demo file, which you can get from the GitHub, and then walking through, really explaining what these are, and they're so powerful. And it's one of those things I think everyone should understand. So it's an hour video, but it really goes through all of the key things about regex. Then I created a video all about the blob point-in-time restore capability and some of the key features that actually make that work. Versioning, change feed, soft delete, and some of the lifecycle management features to add to that for a really optimal solution. So I go through all of that in the video. On to what's new on the compute side. So trusted launch for ephemeral OS disk VMs. Remember, ephemeral OS disks are where there's a certain amount of local storage on the host where the VM runs. This is used for caching, it's used for the temp disk. When I use the ephemeral OS disk, it uses that space to actually store the OS disk for the VM instead of something like a managed disk, obviously that normally would cost me money. If I have a virtual machine whose OS state I don't care about at all, and I can just recreate that every time, using that ephemeral OS disk is very attractive. And so now I can still use Trusted Launch with that. Trusted Launch, remember, is part of the Gen 2 virtual machines that are UEFI based. They had that virtual TPM. It uses features like secure boot, so I have a complete path that is attested from the virtual hardware, the UEFI, all the way through to the booted OS. So now I have that capability in GA. The Azure Monitor Agent, the AMA, is now available for Ubuntu 22.04 and Alma Linux and Rocky Linux. GA. Obviously, CentOS kind of gone away out of support. And so Alma Linux and Rocky Linux are two of the newer distros that are kind of replacing CentOS. So now the Azure Monitor Agent, that replacement for the old Log Analytics agent, the Telegraph, the diagnostics extension, the AMA is based on those data collection rules. Well, that's now GA for those newer distributions of Linux. Static web apps now have a CLI capability. So normally with the Azure Static Web Apps, it's that great ability to easily deploy that pre-rendered content. And typically I would push it with some kind of pipeline. What I can now do with the AZ CLI commands is very, very quickly initialize a new project, set up the configuration around it. I can then go and log into my subscription and deploy a zip file into my static web app. So I don't have to set up the whole pipeline. I can just, via the CLI, go and push something into an Azure Static Web App I have. Azure Container Apps, now Azure Files and Ephemeral Storage. So the Azure Container Apps are that idea around, hey, we have microservices, we have distributed applications, those modern applications. And we like the idea of Kubernetes, but I don't want to learn Kubernetes. I don't have to worry about Kubernetes or Dapper or Kida or Envoy and sidecars. So what Azure Container Apps does is it abstracts away Azure Kubernetes service. I don't have to know or really understand that. It adds things like Dapper and Kida and Envoy, etc., to give me a fantastic environment to build my modern apps and my distributed applications. Well, now with those Azure Container Apps, I can mount Azure file shares. Those would be super useful where I wanted some persistent data. And I can have ephemeral volumes. So this will be local storage, so it's not durable, but I want to be able to share data between containers that are part of the same replica. Azure Container Apps also now have custom domain and TLS cert support in GA. So I could bring my own domains. I have to be able to validate that I do own that. So I have to go and create those validation records in the DNS zone, then validates I own that, and then I can use my own custom certificates as well. And Linux-based Azure Functions, I now have portal-based editing. So with Azure Functions, a number of languages and runtime stacks, I can actually go and edit the code in the portal. Well, now for those Linux-based ones, I can do that as well. On the networking side, ExpressRoute IPv6 global reach support is in preview. So remember the whole point of global reach, I guess I'll draw this super quickly. We have the idea of the Microsoft backbone network. And off of that, you have all of the different regions. And that network also, remember, expands to certain edge locations, carrier neutral facilities. We think of them as meet-me's, peering points where I could connect my location to. Well, imagine I have maybe a location here, and I've established an ExpressRoute circuit to local meet-me's. Now, any of those, I can go and use any region by default in the same, for example, North America, the same continent. But what if I want to be able to use that Microsoft backbone network for communication between my different on-premises networks based on that network? Maybe it has its own network, but I want it for resiliency. Maybe they're in locations that I don't have my own network to connect them. What I could do is obviously run a VNet and some kind of appliance up here and route the traffic through it. But what Global Reach lets me do is just through the Microsoft Backbone network via the meet-me's, they can communicate to each other. I don't have to run anything in a VNet. It's a super efficient path. I'm going to my meet-me and then over the Microsoft Backbone network to my other circuit that I want as part of this global reach configuration. So now it can be IPv4, it can be IPv6, it could be dual. I have those capabilities available to me. Network Watcher now has VMSS packet capture. So this enables me, normally for troubleshooting purposes, I want to capture for a limited duration, maybe some filter. Well now, instead of having to go and do it for each individual instance, I can actually go from 2 to 100 instances. It could be all of the instances or specific ones to set up the capture from the VMSS. So it makes it a lot easier for me to go and configure. I still have the same 5 tuple filters available to me. And also, that was in preview, also now I have connection monitor. So that's useful for connectivity checking, for various tests. And once again, I can now apply that across all of the instances in the virtual machine scale set. Azure Firewall has a whole bunch of updates. So one of these is around the IDPS, so the Intrusion Detection and Prevention System signature lookup. I think it's about 58,000 signatures. And so what I now have in GA is this great ability to smart search and go and find the different signatures that I may care about. And then at an individual signature, I can customize and say, hey, well, for this one, I want to disable it. This one, I want to just alert on it, but not deny, or I want to alert and deny. So I now have that great set of capabilities. TLS certificate auto generation is in GA, useful in non-prod environments. For TLS inspection, i.e. firewall is looking even at TLS encrypted traffic, it has to sit in between the client and the server it's talking to, and the client has to trust my Azure Firewall because it will establish the TLS session with the firewall. The firewall will generate a certificate pretending to be the target I'm talking to. That lets the firewall see the TLS encrypted traffic, the full path, the content to do its job, even on that TLS encrypted. Well, rather than giving it a proper certificate, it can self-generate using this configuration, but generally that's only going to be for non-production environments. So between the Azure Firewall and the client, hey, I can let it now go and set that up automatically. Web categories have gone GA. Structured firewall logs that now let me at a very granular level say exactly what logs I care about based on log analytics tables it would go to, network rules, NAT rules, application rules, IDPS, DNS proxy, many more. And now I can configure the private IPs space for my IDPS, which is used to really understand the types of traffic that's flowing through it. On the storage side, so Azure NetApp files for the Azure VMware solution in preview. Azure VMware solution is that VMware-based hypervisor and private clouds hosted in Azure data centers. Azure NetApp files are those NetApp filers hosted in Azure data centers via a first-party service. Very, very high performance, different offerings available to me. Well, now I can actually take Azure NetApp files, NFS volumes, and mount them on my AVS cloud cluster so it can use it for that very high performance durable storage. Also, Azure NetApp Files has a number of new features that have gone GA. AES encryption for Active Directory, which then includes encryption for my SMB file shares. Different groups of backup policy users and administrative users that get various rights. Obviously, backup users, I can back up, I can restore, I can bypass traverse checking. For the administrators, it's all those permissions, but then add the ability to take ownership, manage logs. Dynamic change of service levels. I can have different capacity pools of the different service levels, and I can take now a volume and move it to a different capacity pool dynamically. So I'm going to carry on using that. So it gives me, for example, I could move from standard to premium without any impact to my users. They've added new cross-region replica pairs. They use the standard Azure pairings, but also have their own additional pairings if I need more flexibility with where I want data replicated to. They also added new regions for their ANF standard network features. So previously, when I used Azure NetApp Files, there were some restrictions on certain network capabilities, and there still are some. But at least with the standard network features, that restriction of the number of IPs I can have in the VNet goes away. I can use NSGs, I can use UDRs, I can use things like ExpressRoute FastPath. So it removes some of those limitations. So more regions now have that support in preview. Databricks is available in new regions. That first party service offered that huge analytics capability that now I can spin up. That's now in Sweden Central and West Central US, in addition to all of the existing regions. On the database side, CosmosDB has a whole bunch of updates. So now I have a 16 megabyte MongoDB API document limit. It used to be 2 megabytes, but now I can go up to 16 megabytes. There's a local Linux emulator for the MongoDB API that I can run on my machine. So it's a local environment that emulates Azure Cosmos DB. Specifically now I can use the MongoDB API. I can test things, I can develop. When it's good to go, I can then take that and move it into the cloud. And serverless storage limit has increased to 1 terabyte. There's different ways I can get the request units we use for doing work against Cosmos DB. There's the whole idea that I'm going to pre-provision. I pay for a certain amount of request units. I use those. The amount of request units used depends on, how am I using the key? How complicated is that lookup? Is it going across different partitions? But if I try and use more than I provisioned, I get throttled, and I'll get kind of warnings to that effect. With serverless, I don't have that. I will just pay for the amount of RUs I'm using. But previously, there was this restriction of 50 gigabytes of data I could use with serverless. Well, now it's increased up to 1 terabyte. Azure Purview now has access policies for Azure SQL Database. So Purview is all about that insight into my data no matter where it is. But now if my data source has been registered for data use management, I can define policies in Purview. These are only around certain roles today. It's data reader, performance monitor, and security auditor. But now I can create those policies centrally in Purview and then apply them to an Azure SQL database, which gives me that centralized management at scale. And then Azure SQL Hyperscale, active geo-replication, and failover is now GA. So the whole point now is active geo-replication is that asynchronous replication at a database level from a primary to a secondary. And this can be across regions. Those secondaries are completely independent. They have their own page servers with the data. Well, then I have an auto failover group, which gives me that simplified management of those geo-replica failover operations. Well, now that hyperscale can be part of that. Miscellaneous, resource configuration change updates. Basically, we have the Azure Resource Manager, which has a huge amount of data about all of the resources in Azure. And what this enables me to do is I can see changes at scale across a subscription, across management groups, even across my Azure AD tenant. there's an incident happens, and I want to go and see, well, what changes were made around that time on my resources? Well, I can go and query the resource changes table in Log Analytics, in the resource graph, not Log Analytics, in the resource graph, and I could say, hey, show me around these particular times. Well, what's happened now is they've increased that duration. So it's now 14 days of resource changes are kept and available for those resource changes in the resource graph. And there's also now additional noise removal. So things around certain types of system updates will be removed. Makes it easier to just focus on the changes I care about. So again, I can just go into resource graph. I can look at resource changes and then, hey, show me things around these certain times. Arc-enabled System Center Virtual Machine Manager is now in preview. System Center Virtual Machine Manager is that on-premises management for my hypervisors. What I can now do is Arc enable it. Remember, Arc is all about extending that Azure control plane to, it was servers, bare metal or virtual, it was Kubernetes environments, and then can lay down data and app and AI services. Well, now I can also Arc enable my SCVMM, which now makes virtual machines showable via the Azure control plane, so I can stop, start, modify via this Arc resource bridge that I deploy. So it's all about, hey, bringing that Azure control plane to more and more types of service. So now those managed by SCVMM are going to start lighting up as well. Microsoft Graph API Event Grid integration. So Microsoft Graph is really that now go-to place for any integration with Azure AD, with Office services and more. Well, now, if there are change notifications from really anything in that Microsoft Graph, I can integrate with them via Event Grid. So there's some change notification in some service using Microsoft Graph. Hey, a user's been added to a group. There's some change in a SharePoint list, whatever that might be. Event Grid lets me have event handlers, a webhook, an Azure function, calling Event Hub, something else. So now any of those change notifications I get from Microsoft Graph, now using Event Grid, I can set up an event handler to go and do some action automatically. Azure Load Testing has a whole bunch of updates. Remember, Azure Load Testing is that managed service to perform load testing at a huge scale based on that Apache JMeter test scripts. So I only pay for when I'm doing the test. It goes and scales up the instances required based on the scale, the volume of the test I want to do. Well, now it supports both system and user assigned managed identities. Remember, user assigned are very useful because if I have multiple Azure resources, need the same set of permission to the same set of other Azure resources, well, now I can just create that one user assigned managed identity with its own lifecycle and give multiple Azure resources the permission to get tokens as it. So it avoids me having to have system assigned for 20 resources and give 20 managed identities the same sets of permissions. Well, now my Azure Load Testing can use either one of those, and that's really useful. Hey, I need to go and access this secret from a key vault. That's where I might want to use managed identity. Oh, not finished. Also, now I can do a quick test. I don't have to create the JMeter script. I can point it at a website. I can optionally say, well, hey, this is how long I want to run the test for. This is a ramp up time. This is the number of users I want to emulate. Go. It will go and create the JMeter script. I could download it if I wanted to, but it's now really easy to just get up and running with doing a quick test. There's also the ability to have a customer managed key support. So for those types of data that has to be encrypted in that Azure Load Testing environment, I could think about things like my test scripts, my configuration files, my secrets, my environment variables. Well, now I can give it a customer managed key that I want all of that to be encrypted with. That gives me more power over the key. It lets me roll the key as I need to. So a lot of nice benefits there. If I'm using a CSV file as an input to my testing, it can now automatically split the file over the multiple engine instances I may have based on the scale I have configured. I don't have to do anything. It's just going to do that for me. I can have user properties configured. So maybe I want to use a certain JMeter test script over multiple different environments, so I need some different settings. Well, I don't have to modify the JMeter file. I can just have these different user properties files for each of the different environments that might have a few tweaked values for different things. Azure AD Dynamic Groups now have nesting support. So what that means is dynamic groups, rather than me statically adding users into the group, it's based on some rule. I create a rule that says, hey, based on these properties, they are a member of this group. This could be a user group, it could be a device group. Now what I can do, as part of those rules, I can look at, well, are you a member of another group? So my rule could now be, hey, this dynamic group is if you're a member of this group, or whatever combination I want to do, that can now drive this new dynamic group. Now today it's not exposed in the portal graphically. So what I would have to do today, and it has examples of this, I have to actually use either the user.memberof or the device.memberof, depending on if it's a user or device rule. But I do now have that ability to say, hey, your membership of this particular dynamic group is based on other memberships you may have. So more and more capabilities are being added there. And that was it. As always, I hope it's useful. And until next video, take care.